Hey there, Hetty here. Today's video is a follow-up of sorts that I've been meaning to post. A second homemade book of shadows / mirrors, this one made for Coven use. So I'm going to start by walking through the process of transforming a basic hardcover sketchbook into a much more handsome, I think, looking receptacle for group work. Note that there isn't going to be a flip through of the interior itself, but before wrapping up this video, I'm going to take a few minutes to discuss what sorts of information I put into my Book of Shadows. Because the question of what to write and how to organize these things is one of those topics without correct answers, but which engenders strong opinions all around, and I thought I'd toss mine out there. So on to the making of the book itself, a process that was remarkably cheap and done over the course of a single day. The ingredients for this particular working were as follows: a sketchbook, bought on sale from a local craft store that was offering them 2 for $10, a fabric of your choosing. I went with this suede-like upholstery fabric, which was already on sale and which the kind gentleman helping me discounted even further. I paid about $11.99 for a half yard, I believe, in the end, which was more than enough for one book. In fact, I probably could have done 2. I've since used a lot of the remainder on other projects. Whatever fabric you go with, though, I'd recommend picking something that hasn't got too much stretch, nor a tendency to fray this time. Leather thongs were another thing I picked up from the arts and crafts store, and they came in a batch of 5 in various brown tones and a black for somewhere between $10 to $12. Now, that's all I actually had to purchase because I already had the rest of what I used at home. Glue. In this case, I actually used some no-seam fabric glue I had kicking around because I'm not really a fan of spelunking through clothing stores, so I tend to wear my clothes into the ground, which means frayed seams and unfolded hems are an inevitability. And this sort of glue works wonderfully to correct the issues and thereby relegate my next shopping trip to a more distant future. For covering the book, it worked a charm. Hopefully the video can pick it up, but the existing cover of the sketchbook is this matte linen-like weave. When it comes to gluing fabric on top, you probably can't beat this sort of texture. It provides excellent grip without requiring boatloads of glue. So if you haven't got a book that you intend to cover, I recommend looking for something with this sort of cover just to simplify your life a bit. Next, of course, I needed scissors for cutting things, a pencil for tracing, which facilitated said cutting of things, a couple of pieces of paper for the inside covers. I used plain heavyweight paper I had at home, and finally, wire and wire working tools like pliers, hammer, wooden cutting board, and a simple needle. As for the wire itself, I used a thick copper wire for the decorative wire-wrapped insignia, and much finer wire, thin enough to thread through a sewing needle, to affix the insignia to the fabric. Combining these ingredients resulted in this. As for the how-to, I began by sectioning the suede into 3 rectangular pieces, 2 pieces for the front and back covers, which should be large enough to fold over the cover and leave about an inch of fabric on the inside cover. Trim off the 2 outside corners, that is, section into a V shape so that they fold neatly over the corners of the cover. The 3rd rectangular piece is for the spine. I recommend making it a bit taller than the height of the book and twice as wide as you want it to be so that it fits perfectly when folded in half and glued into a single double thickness section. To cap each of the corners, 4 total, front and back, I cut out small squares of the fabric, folded them in half to form triangles, and ultimately just glued them in place, folding them over again. All the messiness will be on the inside covers, and we're going to cover those with paper anyway. If you want to sew something onto the cover, like I did with this wire-wrapped emblem, go ahead and sew it on before gluing on the covers. It'll be a damn sight easier than trying to work the needle parallel to the cover. I simply eyeballed the placement and used some thin gauge wire to affix the emblem to the cover material. Because the pieces of fabric that I cut for the cover were a couple inches larger on all sides than I needed, I was able to move that around and get it positioned just how I liked before gluing it down. The braid motif made with the leather thongs I mentioned before was extremely easy to do. I began by making 3 long braids from the leather thongs and glued the ends together so that the braids didn't unravel while I worked. Because I wanted these to function as page markers as well, I made them quite long. I then simply glued them inch by inch onto the covers, beginning at the back corner and tucking the top of the braid under the suede corner cap. If you want to wrap something like this from the back cover to the front, I will note that it's best to not actually glue these to the spine itself, because that shifts and bends quite a lot with use, and your glue will almost certainly come apart over time. So you'll notice that I didn't use glue on the sections wrapped around the spine, and it's held up very well as a result. I continued to glue the braids until I reached the top of the front cover, then measured out how much braid I'd need for my makeshift bookmarks to make it all the way back out the bottom of the book, without pulling. Then a little extra wire was used to bind the braids more prettily, and the excess was snipped off. Done. Truly a very straightforward craft project, and it's now held up to several months of regular use. You'll note that I did, of course, skip over the wire wrapping bit. I'm not going to do a wire wrapping tutorial. You can find oodles of them online if you decide that you like the idea of having wire components or a wire emblem on the cover of your book. And now, what to write? Whence to record? The very short answer to this sort of question that we've all heard before is whatever you want, from wherever you find your material. Which I can't argue with, although I'm not sure it was ever terribly helpful advice for me. Part of this is because it's hard to perceive the answer whatever as either deep or meaningful, nor does it provide an explanation for why any individual choice of what to include or exclude adds power or benefits one's Book of Shadows in any way. So instead, let's frame the question differently. What is it that I, or you, hope their Book of Shadows will achieve? And how do I or you go about making it able to achieve those things? A witch's Book of Shadows is a tool, again, a common bit of wisdom with which I agree, and like all tools, some are probably better suited to certain tasks and less suited to others, depending upon their design. Design dictates how we wield a thing and how comfortably it adapts to being used in new ways. If we're relatively sure that we know exactly how we're going to use a tool, and that we'll need it only in a very specific subset of situations, then we're free to make that tool as streamlined and specifically purposed as we like. By and large, my own path has evolved and changed often enough that a single perfectly designed tool can't, and probably never could, cut it. What I require, and required, is a Swiss Army knife. One of those swank customized ones where you can trade the can opener for a still and stick a compass in the handle. I think the urge to start a new book begins to bubble in the back of my mind when I come to feel constrained by the inflexibility of the tool I've already got. Obviously, if the book's full, that's different. There are designs that at least reduce the frequency with which that happens, even for the prolific. And over the past few years, the desire to start fresh has thus far evaporated once I address that inflexibility. My Book of Shadows has therefore developed a grandma's attic sort of feel. It's a hodgepodge of vital insight and information scattered amidst the bones of ideas long dead, and concepts that were bested by fitter and more formidable ones. I actually like it this way, because it provides a record of what didn't work, what didn't last, and what happened as a result, which lets me do a little archaeological charting and allows me to pick out themes I might otherwise miss. But again, the extent to which this is possible for each of us depends upon what we've been writing down and how freely. If you've assigned 3 pages for Ritual X and still have more to say when you reach the halfway point on page 3, but you're thinking about cutting your own thoughts off because you listed your astrological correspondences on the next page and there's no more room unless you jump to page 15, then I'd argue that you've designed a tool that's just too limiting for you, specifically. Anything that makes you feel like you can't continue writing, or that you have to continue writing and therefore has you reaching for filler, interferes with its own chief purpose as a working book, if that is, in fact, your chief purpose. When that happens, I tend to think that it's a good time to break whatever rule is limiting you, whether it's jotting down "continued on page 15" at the bottom or gluing in extra pages. Both of these are perfect solutions to the chief problem, but each of them can feel imperfect when we've prioritized a specific preconceived aesthetic, one that ultimately doesn't jive with our working style over utility and depth. Here's the part where I mention that my own BOS is both grimoire and Book of Shadows, with fuzzy edges in between. Rituals and workings get edited on the fly as inspiration or intervention alters the plan. These and most of my thoughts about these experiences are recorded while I'm still in circle. In addition to these are pages of devotionals, short spells, and analyses and hypotheses regarding what works, why, or how this may be related to that. A small percentage of pages are occupied by information copied without modification from another source. This is all reference material, stuff I figured it was worthwhile to keep close at hand, so that I could refer to it and modify it as I learned and thought and evaluated. Ultimately, most of this straight-up copying has either been heavily edited or been relegated to the graveyard. The exceptions are generally things that have served as jumping-off points for future exploration, comparison, and manipulation. For instance, I've acquired a collection of alphabets and related charts over time, and although I only rarely consult them, they're often at the back of my mind, and I refresh my memory of them from time to time. I feel like they're growing into something substantial, a rich source of fodder for verbal components of my practice maybe, or maybe something more. An idea will occur to me and I'll find myself flipping between them in order to assess whether some pattern I found holds or is reflected elsewhere. Several of these pages sat unused for a long time too. Their appeal began to emerge only a couple of years after I began collecting them. Like one of those novels bought 3 years ago that you haven't gotten around to reading, but which you know will end up in your hands some lazy day. A couple of pages of Cunningham's herbal correspondences for some of the plants I've come to use regularly, by contrast, never amounted to anything, either because I ended up disagreeing with what he had written, or because the particular associations he listed dealt with topics that I just thus far don't care about and never explored. The pages might as well be glued together for all the use they've served me. Except the graveyard has archaeological value, and so too do the things in it. Over time, it's helped to reveal the blurry boundaries of my own practice by providing examples of what it does not contain, of what pieces didn't fit and were discarded or set aside. Lest it seem like only other people's work ended up there or that I don't like Cunningham, let me just say that it doesn't, and I do. Cunningham was a staple of my early learning and has undoubtedly shaped my thinking in more ways than I'm consciously aware, although my path and his may seem to have little in common these days. Also, plenty of my own ideas have migrated to the conceptual graveyard too. Things that were false starts, or sometimes not. Sometimes they were practices or ideas that were hugely useful and frequently employed, for a time, before they triggered some transformation or realization. They are worth holding on to, those outpaced ideas and practices, even if I don't connect with them anymore, even if they seem shallow and unsophisticated now. They were the halting first steps to my current sprint, a sprint I fully anticipate future me will look back on as a lumbering jog at best. For one thing, some of these early and now past their prime practices worked really, really well for all their simplicity and sometimes dumb luckiness. They're the sort of thing I can reference and read off to friends who are looking for just that sort of working. For another, they clearly chart where I was mentally, emotionally, and spiritually at the time. For a third, who's to say I'll never again find myself someplace where those workings and devotionals will gain a second life? Who's to say that they won't become fodder for something grand and ambitious in the future, like all those alphabets and seals that have made it into my book? To some, having these old bones sticking out of an otherwise perfectly manicured garden is maddening. They'd rather rip those pages out, and can do so neatly with a post-bound design or a really good knife. I understand and would probably feel the same if I had approached my own book as a project that would always be precise and perfectly curated. I knew it was a risk going in, which is why I took more of an English garden approach. That is, I let the book grow organically without worrying about the fact that it's clearly a mishmash of different things that vary considerably in tone, appearance, and ultimately significance. One thing this approach has going for it is that once you hit a certain volume of random variation and messiness of writing, it works as a whole and becomes aesthetically pleasing in its messiness. I'll note that a properly maintained index, or set of them, helps a lot too. Oh, and dates and page numbers. But even so, it can still feel like a break in the pattern, like it's too much of a deviation to introduce something utterly new. The reality is, of course, that it's rarely a break. More often, almost always really, it's a theme that's been running latent in the background. It's at points like these, when I get that sort of feeling, that I like to flip pages back in time and add notes to old entries, including the ever-useful combine with page 132 and then go see 267. It's in flipping back in time that we often find the roots of an idea that's now in bloom. Now, all of this brings me to the concept of value. I think a book of shadows can and should contain things that contribute value and utility in various ways, which is another way of saying that informational value isn't the only sort that matters. Some of these ways are ones I've already discussed or referenced: historical value, aesthetic value, a look and hence a feel that evokes the sort of emotions in its user that are conducive to their work. My personal Book of Shadows is less than perfectly lettered. Things written in haste by firelight swerve wildly across the page, telegraphing my state of mind at the time of writing. I find it inspirational. It speaks to me of the need to get things down on paper now, a no-fuss focus on getting shit done that makes me want to dive into the thinking and doing part of the work, rather than the transcribing. That makes me want to recapture the experiences that led to that hasty scrawl. So inspirational value, which may be easiest to find in others' experiences and words when we're first starting, but is probably most potent when the source of that inspiration is one's own adventures, which one, of course, accumulates over time. Part of this, I think, is that the materials and records of one's own experiences can function as a cue that facilitates later re-immersion. So let's add cue value to the list too. This one argues strongly for the benefit of including things like pressed herbs used in past working, sachets of leftover filling from a poppet bundled in a square cloth and tied to a ribbon for use as a bookmark maybe. These sorts of things, which are easy to perceive as simple affectations when we see them shown off on Instagram, and I'm not saying that they never are, but they can have real potency beyond the aesthetic. Other people's seemingly shadow bits and bobs may tap into something deeper and more important than they let on, or perhaps than they even realize themselves yet. Good ideas abound around us. Cast a critical eye at them for a couple minutes, and we may uncover a brilliant surprise that is worth incorporating in our book now, even if we never have before. Now, let's get back to the thing I was saying before about inflexibility. Back to the question of what kind of tool I'm looking to build. At some point, it became clear that I was tired of using my book exclusively as a reference, a vehicle for words and images, that I wanted a book that was also an altar. This was only the most recent transformation. It's been through several metamorphoses already. Whole pages can become spells in and of themselves, with seals and places for candles mapped in ink, and the components tucked into a pocket within. Pages can be ripped out shred by shred and burned as part of other workings. Do you have some pages written during a dark time in your book that you'd like to explore now that you've gained a little distance? Consider using a few of those pained words themselves as literal fuel for the ritual fire every time you delve into that shadow. I don't think we should worry about adding new components to the tool over time. nor ultimately removing components, although I'd advise being much more selective of this part and summarizing or reproducing those sections removed so that you don't artificially muddy the trail you've come by. If the options are either to abandon a book or transform it, we might as well start by trying transformation. We can always resort to the former if that doesn't work out. Funnily enough, my book is something I've been relying on less and less for working out my thoughts on broad technical topics, or more accurately, organizing those thoughts, because I've been doing a lot of that here in the process of composing material for this channel. And in writing this material down for dissemination, I've had to spend more time explaining my thought process than I ever bothered to do in my Book of Shadows. Some of these videos, like the ones on timing, are 10,000 words long. My book contains perhaps a tenth of that, and it's scattered throughout, often implicit in the way I design different workings rather than explicitly stated. It was, in other words, one of those latent threads that was woven into the whole unnoticed and unremarkable for a long time. An overarching theme. In my book, they're usually hiding in the details and margins, visible only by the little footprints they leave that belie the true size and weightiness of the concept that left them. Some of the true gems of your practice are the things you don't write, the implicit bits of knowledge and assumption that you lean on without ever consciously realizing. They're probably in the material you use weekly, and they're in the graveyard too. And they can only be tracked once we've given them the cover of enough words to coax them out of their foxholes. All of which is to say that, in my opinion, what belongs in a Book of Shadows is this: fucking everything that I think may serve as fuel or fodder for my work. In stark contrast to cooking, there's very little downside to adding too much. And with that, I'll wish you a wonderful day and happy crafting.